thank you very much for inviting me, and I think a big thank you to Miguel and Fran and everyone at the team who have pulled this together. I've had a chance to tune into a couple of the talks so far, and they've been very interesting, stimulating, and it's kind of a real privilege to be here. I was just flicking through the attendees, some familiar names, some of whom will know a lot more about policymaking and have more experience than I have. But I wanted to share today a few reflections on work that I've been involved in and others at School of International Futures around helping policymakers and decision makers think about maintaining a longer term perspective in times of crisis or disruption. I think as I thought through what I wanted to say today, I probably steered slightly away from the core message around policy making and more about kind of how we can collectively do long-term thinking better. But I thought it was a really interesting provocation that Fast Forward put together around the visible threats, governments rushing to adopt imperfect policies to protect citizens and defend national sovereignty. And that's really where I started thinking. And I'm going to share a few lessons from UK government's previous thinking around futures work and how it can integrate into policy making, and then a couple of lessons from other organizations around the world who have tried to apply futures work to crisis. So I'm hoping everyone can see my slides. So where do we start? I think most people who are listening will believe that the need to take a long-term view of what could and should lie ahead isn't a distraction from the present, even in a time of crisis or a time of significant uncertainty. It's kind of essential. The decisions we make today really can shape the way how will have long-term repercussions and shape the world and the future. And it's critical that we kind of keep that long-term view as we make any policy decisions or just in our personal practice through our lives. One thing we often say at SWAF is there's no shortage of insights about the future. I was going to put lots of pictures of different pandemic thinking, but decided just to leave it blank because it's everyone everyone has kind of something to bring to this kind of discussion. So instead, I was looking yesterday back at some work that the UK government did and published in 2007. It was commissioned by David King, who was then the government chief scientific advisor in the UK Government Office for Science in the Foresight unit there. And loads of different people have contributed to it. And it was live for a fair while and publicly available. The idea was to look at some of the issues that might be coming up on a policy horizon, looking out 0 to 2 years and all the way out to kind of 2100. And there are hundreds of papers produced spanning lots of policy issues. And I went back just to have a quick look to see what there was done around pandemics and found a wildcard that they were talking about the bio breakout, a world swept by pandemics. It's important just to remember these were never intended as predictions. They're intended to be provocations to help people think about some of the longer term shifts, some of the longer term changes and some of the issues that might come up that policymakers need to be aware of. It was produced by the UK government. IFTF in the US were involved in the original Delta scan. Then there was a Sigma scan, which was outsourced in part to Ipsos Mori. And it really was taking a forward look, but it interestingly kind of looked at some of the early indicators, some of the parallels and precedents, and tried to draw on evidence which is always quite hard to do in policymaking, especially when thinking about the future. So looking at the bio breakout, and I'm not going to spend too much time on coronavirus and COVID. I'd rather draw some more general points. One of the things I did find interesting was that they took a very global perspective. They were thinking at the time about although they did talk predominantly about avian flu, which some say might have distracted people from current COVID coronavirus, they were very much looking at this as a global pandemic that would ground air travel, lockdowns and martial law, but also some of the opportunities such as how volunteers could prop up the healthcare sector. And if you read through it, there'll be things you'd say, well, that's clearly interesting given where we are now. There's other things that you'd say, well, they got that wrong, which is understandable. And this is just one example of how of pandemic thinking that's come up around the world. And following various threads over the last couple of months, people have been kind of raising the question of, why didn't we see this coming? Or did we see this coming? Why didn't we get action? So just keep that in mind. I'll come back to that in a minute. Just as another example, this is this one in blue in the bottom is around leaving the ever closer union. Effectively, they had on an 11 to 20 year time horizon in 2007, the fact that the UK, the way that things, the situation in Europe may play out, and in the UK may resurface the issue about whether the UK should be tied to the EU or not. And we've obviously seen that play out as well. What was interesting for me most when thinking about this is that this scan was eventually closed down by UK government, partly depending on who you talk to, partly because it was slightly politically risky. It wasn't kept up to date. It became a potential liability for government, but it also never had the intended impact that that I think the people who commissioned it hoped it would have. And it was interesting, there's an article today from David King, who commissioned this, talking about the fact that the UK did actually do a lot of pandemic preparations that weren't necessarily implemented in the recent crisis. I'm not going to get into that either, but I do think that there's some interesting lessons that can be learned. And the key things that I've seen in the discussions about why people think the pandemic was a surprise: poor planning, possibly, a lack of imagination, possibly, a failure of foresight. And this is something that futures practitioners do need to think about, is given all these discussions that were happening, what is it that has meant that foresight and insights from foresight have failed to be translated into policy decisions? I think there are some successes, so I'm not saying it's complete failure, but something that we need to take ownership for as a group as we think about how to implement futures work effectively in the longer term. There are, of course, political realities. I think most policymakers will acknowledge that there's sometimes only so much that they can do whilst working within a system. So what are the kind of, how can we improve governance, embed futures thinking from at a national level? There's great examples from the Future Generations Act in Wales to the work done in Hungary or Slovenia to really try and embed futures thinking at a kind of institutional level. But I think, so moving on from that, some common challenges in policy making. It's often difficult to make time. So when designing futures work, it's important to kind of build ownership from the beginning. Often it's not in leaders' interests, especially in a time of crisis. What is it that's going to be the most important thing for them to focus on? It's probably not going to be the longer term, or at least they don't think it is at the time. It can be an alien process and people don't feel that they own it. So insights are being shared quite often from external people. It really needs to be owned and embedded by the people who are making the decisions, the policymakers. The line of sight issue is important, and thinking in multiple horizons to really surface what some of the longer term repercussions are, but bringing it back. I'll come on to that in a second. There's also something around embedding futures work at the heart of government, so building kind of foresight literacy within the civil service. And there are examples of how that's been done effectively in some countries such as Singapore, where all civil servants get exposed to futures thinking. And if any of you tuned into Real Miller's talk, I'm sure you'll have heard lots about how we can also build futures literacy into kind of our wider work. And people like Peter Bishop talking about how we can teach futures at a kind of educational level early on. But really helping people to understand alternatives and the role that the longer term horizon can have in decision making. The final piece is around evidence and making things credible. And I think there's been lots of people talking about how you can communicate this kind of work effectively. We're also notoriously bad at making predictions. I think if you look at these quotes, which are there because they're obviously wrong, people often just when we're grounded in the here and now and just talking to ourselves and the people we know in this kind of filter bubble world that people talk about, it's hard to kind of see things from other people's perspectives. The image on the left is a prediction about what the future of education may look like. We quite often use it just to illustrate that while some things they get right, it's interesting that there's no women in that room. And people, you're really kind of, it's about kind of, you're putting your own perceptions about the future. So, and the final kind of thought is ensuring that people act on recommendations. I was involved in some work a while back with the airline industry, and we made some recommendations about pandemics. There was some follow-up, but there was no real, as a futures practitioner coming in from the outside to work with that organization, what I'm trying to reflect on what it is I could have done more of to try and help get the message across and ensure that kind of longer term action takes place. And it's not really my position as an outside person to do that. Maybe it's around how we design the exercises and how we communicate them that's going to have the most impact. So what do we need to do more of? We need to think in multiple horizons. We need to engage our imagination to stretch and challenge thinking. We need to really embrace the periphery and avoid consensus thinking and start to build our capability. And remember that the ramifications, the decisions we make today will have ramifications for the future. I'm not going to get into too many models. This is a 3 horizons model. I think it just illustrates that where we are now, where we're going, and the change that we're going to go through. You can think about insights at different levels. The transition points are really important, but that transition point could be 12 months out, it could be a year out, it could be 10 years out. It really depends on the question you're asking and the time frame you're looking at. So in a time of crisis, what can we do? This is an example of some of the work done by, spelled wrongly, the Danish Emergency Management Agency. They call it the Pandora Cell, and it was an experiment and a successful one in how to bring futures work into a kind of a crisis response. Their time horizon when they talk about futures work is originally 24 hours. So they're doing this kind of process of going through what do we know, how do we make sense of it by looking at the past and the present, how can we reframe and think differently to what we think the expected trajectory is, and then how can we, what do we need to do now, what do we need to do later? It's a kind of whole process of going through sense making and sense breaking very quickly. And they have these archetypes. The green one on the left is kind of crisis getting back under control, but what if it exacerbates? What if it gets prolonged? What if it's fatiguing? And what if something else comes along to reframe the situation? It's an interesting model and worth looking at. They start with a 24-hour horizon, and as every day goes on, the horizon gets longer and longer and longer. But I think the lesson is that in a time of crisis, you can do futures thinking, and you need to keep an eye on the long term, because otherwise you may miss things. They also have this way of looking at things. They say looking behind, understanding the past, looking above, taking a helicopter view, looking below to find the diamond in the rough. Really just, the point is look at things from different directions, try and see past the initial crisis to think about what next, what else might be happening, what can we do to make a difference. From Brexit, a lot of the discussions that we're involved in were around research and innovation. There was a lot of concern about what would happen to relationships between the EU and the UK in terms of research and collaboration, clinical trials. But there was also a lot of discussions around what this means for kind of, will we have the right skill sets? How will we be able to collaborate? What our options are in the world? One of the things that we found worked really well when you have an event on the short-term horizon that might have really important implications for which way the world might go in, was to quickly get that down, to have a framework which drew attention to that kind of crisis, help people see or that decision point, help people see which direction the world might then be going in, but to really then push them out, just to say, okay, well, what really matters in the longer term? I'm going to skip this slide quickly and just move on. This data isn't meant to show anything hugely inspirational, but in this was around the importance of clinical trials in the UK and the difference between short-term and long-term priorities. If you just ask the question about what's important in the five-year time horizon and don't think about shorter and longer-term horizons, you'll miss things. It was clear that there was going to be massive issues around alignment of regulation in the short term, and those were going to persist, but the shift was going to be about, we ideally want to have a really close relationship to the EU, and I'm trivializing slightly, but if we don't have that, what can we do? We still need to be able to work in a world which gives us access to pool clinical trials data, to minimize the regulatory barriers to doing clinical trials. But there might be alternative ways of looking and working with alternative countries around the world. But as time goes on, advances in medicine, levels of clinical trials, of innovation are going to become really important. So what is it we can really do to stretch people's thinking, to think about, okay, this event's important, but we have all these changes going on a longer term cycle, how do we get into them? And one of the, this slide's titled wrong. One of the conversations that seems to be playing out at the moment is, and this is a quote from Roger Dennis, who some of you may have heard speaking on the right, which is around, there's loads of scenarios being put out there around how COVID's going to play out, lots of economic predictions about when there'll be a kind of return to growth. But are we thinking widely enough around what paradigm we're living in, and whether the world will actually return to the same level of order? And that may be because some of the negative things play out, some of the positives as well might change how people live, how they think, and how they work. So economic modeling, prediction around the epidemiology is all great, but we don't yet know enough about how the epidemiological stuff is going to play out, whether vaccines will work, herd immunity, stuff like that. We need to be a bit more imaginative, I think, than a lot of the scenarios that are out there are being at the moment. And I challenge people to look at this later maybe and say, is this really the worst case scenario that I can think of? I'm hoping also the best case can be improved as well. So just a few more thoughts. Engaging the periphery. I've taken this diagram from Nesta, from their playbook for innovation learning. They intended it for a very different purpose, as a way of thinking about innovation and where your innovation function sits within government. If you look at it from a view of where does your scanning or your foresight function sit, you'll see different models. A lot of people have a centralized one in one ministry, say sitting alongside a Prime Minister's office. Others will have scattered ones throughout the departments. But in terms of where you're looking for your innovation, I think what we try and say is that you need to be moving to more an integrated approach across governments, having futures embedded within thinking. And when you're looking for your insights, to have it centrally owned so that it's going to have impact, but to be engaging with your periphery and the separate side. So where are those sources of innovation? Where's the divergent thinking? How can we kind of move away from just consensus? This is an example. Again, I've taken out most of the useful information, but it's just wanted to say this is a driver's exercise we did with a bunch of international governments, and it exposed some really different ways of thinking around the role of religion, the role of resources in the environment, and how they would play out in the future and have an impact on the issue they were looking at. I didn't have time to draw out the kind of consensus view, but if you look at it, you see very different insights if you look for the consensus and you look for the divergent thinking. Again, very, very simplifying slightly. So at SWAF, one of the things we've been doing, and one of the reasons we set up what we call the Next Generation Foresight Practitioners Awards, was to really, we could see lots of amazing thinking going on around the world from a young generation of upcoming kind of futures practitioners. But we saw a slight gap in terms of the recognition that they were getting from maybe more traditional academic groups or kind of slightly different societies. And we wanted to kind of set up an award, a prize to recognize one or two small individuals and build a cohort of kind of fellows. But that was one ambition. The other ambition was to really try and see how we could support and invest in signals and ideas coming from next generation thinkers, and really kind of bring people together across generations, within generations, to generate insights. And we now have an amazing group of 30 fellows from, we've had applicants from over 50 countries, and we're kind of running the award again this year with a slight twist in that we've also introduced a kind of, in addition to the main award of $15,000, we've also introduced two kind of walkabout prizes for 18 to 25-year-olds who may have less experience, but are also powerful, kind of working to change their communities or issues across the world. We still believe that the award is one part, the program is broader about it. It's about kind of helping support that generation and also kind of support their thinking. And it's been really amazing to see, and you might have heard some of Corinne or Prupal or Leah talking over the last few days, or will do. They've come together and really mobilized around COVID to start tapping into some of the signals coming out around the world, to coordinate thinking, to drive and challenge and reframe. And you can read some of their publications online or tap into some of their thinking around scenarios. But it's been a really interesting exercise that we'll share more on about how they've come together to really start and challenge thinking. We also just want to say a big thank you to the judges, many of whom I've just pulled out, some of the ones who are speaking today, who kind of really have been supporting and nurturing the next generation. And we can't really say enough of a thank you to them for the work that they're doing as well. Just drawing this to a close, just a final reflection. This is a quote from Wendy Schultz. You can't control the future, but you can influence it by what you choose to do and what you choose not to do. And the decisions we make today will have ramifications and aftershocks over time. So as we're thinking in multiple horizons, thinking about what it is we need to do to adapt to the immediate crisis, what are the longer term changes in society and shifts that are happening that will kind of play out over the next 20, 40, 80 years, and provide new opportunities, new challenges for how we can work with citizens as policymakers. The other thing to bear in mind is, and this is one of the things that come out of COVID, just maybe to illustrate this, the responses that different countries are making now to how they trace, how they monitor, how they let people back out of lockdown into transition will have implications for what becomes seen as maybe acceptable and normal around privacy and surveillance. I'm not sure how I feel about some of these issues yet. I need to do more thinking on it. But when we're making crisis decisions, we need to be thinking about, okay, does that lock us into a pathway or a future which we're happy to be living in 20, 30, 40 years time? How does it impact the next generation? And how does it impact future generations who aren't yet born, but will be living in that world that we're creating? So really thinking in those multiple horizons becomes very important. Finally, what can we do to build our capability? I talked briefly around foresight as a curriculum. I think there's a lot more that can be done to help policymakers understand futures, understand how to use futures, when to use it within the policy cycle, and when not. It's not always the most appropriate tool, and policymakers have limited resources, have to make quick decisions. But what are the small changes that can be made to help them be more effective long term? How can we get past issues with political cycles, with people moving on and up and out through kind of civil services, and really try and embed institutionalize futures thinking within government? There's great examples. There's a lot of countries at the moment looking out at national strategy and what can be done to make that more participative, more futures oriented, and really kind of fit for the future. This is one thing that we do feel very strongly at SWAF, is that futures work should be participative, and it shouldn't be owned by, although we sometimes get framed as consultants, we try and build capability of organizations rather than try and push particular agendas on them. It really needs to be participative. It needs to be co-created with the communities we're trying to influence, and not just as kind of extractive, what do you think, but what do you want, and how can we help then deliver that together? So Futures is for everyone, and there's a lot we can do more of it within policy making. This is my final slide. Foresight is hard, there's no silver bullet. Just really need at this time just to be challenging assumptions, understanding what we know and what we don't know about the future, and connecting to diverse thinkers from around the world, from communities. And I think this event has been an amazing opportunity to bring together and share insights about futures thinking. But also, what is it you can do as a challenge to invest in within your organization, in your community, within your governments? What is it we can do to improve capability and bring foresight to life and ensure that we are having that longer term view? So that's it from me. That's really all I wanted to share. So I'm going to stop there and just have a quick look at the Q&A and see how we're doing. So there seem to be two questions. One from Helka around capability, and what about adaptability, and what do you think about it? I'm going to be guessing, Helka, exactly what you mean about adaptability, but we quite often talk about agility maybe rather than adaptability. There's within a time of crisis or disruption, and I'm not sure I'm going to quite answer your question. I think there's something really important about having the structures and the processes in place to be able to quickly sense what is going on, how are people thinking. And I think you'll have heard from people like Dave Snowden around SenseMaker, and there's lots of other approaches and tools for tapping into thinking that's happening around the world, around communities, and it's getting easier and quicker with social media and with machine learning AI tools, but there's also risks with disinformation. But the ability to really quickly tap into information, to make sense of it, is really important. The ability to kind of tap into experts, so as policymakers, drawing on academic expertise, drawing on consensus views to understand what we know already, but also where are the gaps. And I think that's my thing around divergent thinking. And then having systems in place to plug it in to decision-making processes and kind of cascade that across an organization is really important. So I think it's really important. Yeah, my answer is I think it's really important. If Helka, you want to share any more about what you were meaning by adaptability, I'm happy to kind of pick it up again. Couple more questions. So in a time of crisis, how can we ensure futures thinking policy matters don't just focus on addressing the crisis at hand? We're already seeing the economic, educational and workplace relations effects of the current health crisis. There'll probably be social effects after this that we haven't begun to think about. So how do we ensure policymakers account for these less pressing issues? I think that's a really interesting question. We've been doing some work for the last 2 weeks with an international organization trying to help them think about some of the longer term implications of the way that the crisis is rolling out in a certain region. And it is really hard. We're just at the stage where we're trying to pull together some of the messages that the group that we've been working with think are really important. And the challenge I think that they're trying to do is how do they build on the established thinking that's already happened. There's been amazing economic analysis, prediction, like forecasting work that's been done. There's clearly already an understanding of what some of the shorter term kind of horizons are. But what they've been trying to do is think about the wider system, how starting with different lenses. So it's looking at kind of what's happening globally, what's happening regionally, what's happening in specific countries or types of countries, and then within communities, focusing in on the most disadvantaged communities that they can think of, and what their future needs will be and how the kind of systems can evolve. And one of the lessons that's come out of that, I hope, or I think, is that there's the traditional ways that they're working and intervening might need to change because there'll be new actors, new communities that they can work with. The private sector's role in provision of some of these services may change, and there may be localization, so people may have new needs. So really kind of having a systemic point of view, looking at where the intervention points are that will make a most difference for them to start to intervene, it becomes really important. So yeah, thinking about the systemic issues, how they'll play out over time, and then where it is that you can intervene, but also understanding how you then, thinking back in time, backcasting or other approaches to understand what it is you need to start doing today, because as a certain future emerges, it's going to become really important, or things that make sense to do in all situations to just get ready for the future. A lot of people are thinking 18 months out, 2 years. There's not much time to create institutional change or with limited resources to start to address these things if they don't start them now, because they're going to take time to put the capability in place. Okay, so top 3 qualities of a great futurist. That's interesting. Openness and willingness to change would be one of them. I wouldn't necessarily view myself as a great futurist. I'm very much a researcher, a geneticist by training, and I'm very naive about many things. Really being able to listen to others, understand different perspectives, and help others to kind of surface the insights that they already kind of intuitively know. Those are some things I think are really important. There are different types of futurists. There's people who are very predictive and can make grand visions and statements about the future. There's others who I would more view myself as a researcher who does futures work. So it's much less about prediction. And just passion, I think, is the other one that's really important. So I think there's 3 there. Just looking at time. Okay, more questions coming through. Do we need to distinguish between foresight architecture, enabling policy foresight, and process methods? Which jurisdictions have the best practice in foresight architecture in your view? So at SWAF, we tend to be quite method agnostic. We spend a lot of time on what we call the scoping phase and the integrating futures phase of a project. We have a 4-stage process we follow. So this is going to come slightly tangentially at Sally at your question. There are loads of methods and approaches. You can combine them in many different ways. But if you throw the wrong methods at the wrong question, and you haven't thought about how you're going to then communicate insights back into your organization or the system you're trying to influence, and you haven't thought about the governance structures of your project, who you need to be engaging with to help you build traction downstream, it doesn't really matter what methods you use. Your project will probably fail. So I think you can look at it from at a project level, you can look at it at a process or methods level, and you can look at it as an architecture level, which I'm assuming you mean things such as how do you embed foresight into decision making within a country's kind of architecture. So there's some great examples of legislative approaches to. So if you think about the executive, the legislative, and kind of the other levels of government, you can find good examples of how different countries have tried to embed futures thinking into government. There's some who've set it up in acts, like the Wales. Finland has a really good model, which people think have been quite effective. But there's also seems to be an increasing role for audit organizations such as the Government Accountability Office in the US, who see their kind of motto as being moving from hindsight to insight to foresight. So I think there's different levers which will work well in different countries and different societies. what I think there's less of at the moment is work being done in the open policy making space, or kind of that to really kind of understand what citizens want and engage them in kind of decision-making processes which have that kind of futures lens. There are examples from Singapore, Malaysia, where they've done really broad participative consultations across their citizens. We were involved in a piece of work trying to work with Oman to help them have a more citizen-focused dialogue with their citizens around the vision that they're developing, looking out to 2040. And that was really around trying to bring citizens together with ministers, with public officials, to have a conversation about what different people wanted about the future, and really trying to kind of cut through society that way is really important. So next one, according to how you to bring, one second. Having a constructive attitude and build trust between decision makers and populations in times where both change in the leading landscape is not possible, and at the same time working together with a team in place is key during emergency. I'm not sure if that's a question or a statement. I would agree. Trust is critical. Communication is also very critical. So I'm not sure that's specifically a futures point, but just how early you can communicate and set, help people to understand the changes that are coming and what they're going to need to do, and see that conversation in a constructive manner. And I'd leave that probably more to officials who are used to communicating with the public. I'd have quite, but I do think that communication part is key. DY has asked a question about involving general public in dialogues and reimagining. I think that's really critical. Again, I'm going to think this reminds me of some work we did in Mozambique around peace and reconciliation. Whenever we do work in countries or communities where we're coming in from the outside, we try and ensure there's a local partner, and we are working collaboratively with people who know the country and the community well or better than we do. So we often try and think of our work that we do in communities as supportive of other people who are owning and marshalling that from within the community. So in Mozambique, we worked with a local university partner who brought in facilitators and really helped us kind of work both within the Lusophone community, but also to kind of build an engagement which wasn't just a one-off, but we would be doing kind of follow-up and kind of longitudinal work with that community over time. I think there's a risk where policymakers, there's some very good examples of where, especially around science policy, where people have engaged public in dialogues about what they want about, say, the future of GM. There's also some very bad examples. But if you can build, the trick is to do that at scale, and also to build that kind of trust and dialogue, and help people see how that work is then linking into decision making. So there's attempts to try and do it not just early, but also through policy development. But that only really works if you have an open policy environment. In some countries, they have a very much a closed policy development approach, and then they open up for a consultation at the point at which it's going through or has gone through Parliament. Other people are doing kind of open policy making and driving engagement much more early on. So I think there's some great examples out there, but it's still very much an emerging field. And I'd encourage you to ask Dave Snowden that question, because he'll give you a very different response. Helka Pirinen, I mean how to increase the adaptability in organizations and teamwork, mindset and actions. Okay, brilliant. I think if you're trying to increase the adaptability in organizations and teamwork, I think champions are really important, especially to have someone who at some level, relatively senior, who sees the value of futures work, will help you get any kind of initiative off the ground. But ultimately you want the organizations and kind of that mindset to move from being forced from an individual down to being something that's adopted across the organization. And there's different ways to do that. It's something that some of the organizations that we work with and have talked to over the last 4 or 5 years struggle with this, especially when we're first trying to get foresight work up and running and off the ground in organizations, because there's always other priorities and there's always other kind of initiatives that, there's always other priorities. I think that's probably what I'm going to say. We encourage people to start looking for the quick wins that they can do to start to prove the values of futures thinking, or to kind of take people through a futures process. And you can do that just by intentionally introducing a longer term perspective into certain management discussions. You can do it by picking a topic and running a quick exercise so people start to see the value. But I think the biggest change is when it gets embedded into the culture of the organization, where either through the values, through the training, or through processes that help. We quite often have this, there's a very simple tool, which I've just put back up, which is we call our capability matrix. And it's really just designed to help people think about, if you're going to do this, you need to be thinking about the processes, the assets, the organization, the people. So building your champions, but also embedding the culture within staff and leaders, communicating insights, and getting scanning processes set up within your organization where you're sharing interesting perspectives that come up, but you're kind of communicating insights so people start seeing the benefit. The structure and culture and the programming is probably some of the trickier bits to do, especially in large international organizations such as the UN, but they've really tried to build in the UN, build in foresight at different levels, from the kind of Director General level and some of the kind of broader vision structures. You can view the SDGs as a kind of a large vision, basically, of where the world we want from a systemic perspective, and then trying to embed it into some of the kind of programming and roles that they have to do from within the organization all the way down to kind of the resident coordinator level. But it's tough. So just checking on time. I think we have up to another 15 minutes. Do you think we must have future politics? How can we make theme shift and quicker response to a better future and choose for sustainability? Or are they aware because of the crisis that we have to change in the right direction? It's quite a challenge. I think a lot of policymakers are aware that there are shifts and changes going on in society, not just around the environment and all the kind of climate action, and not just because of COVID and the fact that that's brought to light probably some existing fractures that exist within the world. I think there is a risk that, and this is something I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on, there seems to be a lot of articles being written about whether change is going to happen as a result of the current crisis, or whether we're going to snap back to a world which is predominantly the same as before, but with a few tweaks. I think there's a lot of opportunities. There may well be shifts in how people think about their health, consumers, families, values. There may be really good opportunities in terms of the fact that some of the positive shifts that have happened recently around climate emissions may continue. But I do think there's a risk of that as soon as people feel that this crisis is over, that it's back to policymaking as usual. And I think that's a challenge to policymakers and futurists and everyone else to try and kind of keep that kind of activity going. So pandemics were identified by Foresight as an event of the future. Why did the answer fail so much? I think that's a challenge we need to be addressing and thinking about. I've seen a lot of people making quite grandiose statements about the fact that they predicted this. And I also seen quite a few, and it seems to be a call, and I think this is something that Paul Saffo is thinking about at the moment, is why is it that the Futures and Foresight didn't do more, and why didn't it? And I think that's a question we need to be exploring. And I think that's one of the challenges I was trying to get across in the talk. I don't have a good answer to this. I don't think there's one simple answer, but I think there's a general need for us to do more about long-term thinking. How do you see the public to really participate in futures work and policy making? With the exception of experiential futures, many are expert-based. Have you had experiences with other methods? That's a question from Steph. I think that depends on how you define foresight and futures work. If you were to map, I've tried to do this a few times and map out the different communities that exist within the foresight world, from design futures, experiential futures, people who think of themselves in strategic foresight, people who are thinking of themselves more as in the prediction space. And then as you start to bring in things like open policy, open dialogue, evidence-based policy making, you start to see blurred lines. I think a lot of the innovation that's going on in terms of participation is happening outside of the foresight space and being brought into it as people draw on developments elsewhere and think about how it translates into decision making. There was a report by Nesta, which some of you on the call may have been involved in, many of you may have read, which was looking at participative futures methods. There's some really great examples in there, and I encourage you to look at the reports. What I think is lacking at the moment is sufficient evidence about how approaches to participation in futures work impacts policy making. So at the moment, I think we're still learning and looking to apply a lot of the approaches and really try and build up an evidence base around how effective these kind of futures approaches are. There are hundreds of examples, a lot of them from Singapore. And Daniel, thanks for sharing the report. It's nice to see you online. Singapore have been doing participative futures work for ages, as have many other countries. But one of the questions is, how do you improve the impact of any futures work? Quite often, futures thinking influences other people's thinking, but isn't actually recognized as the sole contributor to why a decision was made. I've done work in UK government, which I think has helped drive investment strategies around and influence the industrial strategy that the UK now has. It would be very hard to prove. Similarly, we did work around social care, and which contributed to thinking around the aging. This is a kind of an ongoing question about what is the ultimate impact of futures work. I think you can quite often get some qualitative statements about how it's changed people's perspectives, how it's helped people to kind of draw insights that they wouldn't otherwise have had from more traditional approaches. But until we build up the evidence base of where participative futures works has helped, it's going to be hard. Sally, happy to chat if you want to get in touch on your capability development work. New norms in policy making, will this be the same across boundaries of different countries? Jezreel, I think that's a really interesting point. And again, I'd like to talk more on that, but not time. So I'm rather than taking any more questions, I'm just going to say, if anyone would like to get in touch with me, I'm going to drop you can probably get your email from the organisers, or email me at peter@soif.org.uk. I just want to say a big thank you to the organisers and to all of you joining. I've enjoyed chatting. I prefer being in dialogue rather than broadcast, but I appreciate your attention and thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of the programme. So thank you.